They stripped me of my home, my reputation, and my marriage. But they made one fatal mistake. They invited me inside their fortress to be the fall guy. I wasn't just there to clean their floors. I was there to tear their entire organized scheme to the ground. The rain didn't just fall. It felt like a relentless assault against my skin, turning my only remaining pair of jeans into heavy, sodden weights. I stood on the sidewalk clutching a single black trash bag that held the entirety of my existence. A few hours ago, I had been a son-in-law. I had been a provider, a husband, a man with a future. Now, thanks to the cold, calculated cruelty of my wife's parents, I was a ghost haunting the streets of a neighborhood I couldn't afford to live in. It all started with a misunderstanding, or rather, an orchestrated lie. My father-in-law, a man whose wealth was only eclipsed by his arrogance, had decided that I was draining his family's potential. He had spent months planting seeds of doubt, whispering into my wife's ear until she looked at me with the same cold, detached eyes as her father. When the ultimatum came, it wasn't a conversation. It was an eviction. They threw my belongings onto the lawn while I was at my shift at the warehouse. By the time I arrived, the locks were changed, and a patrol car was idling at the curb just to ensure I didn't cause a scene. I had nowhere to go, no savings left thanks to a family investment that had conveniently vanished into their private accounts, and a reputation that they had systematically dismantled behind my back. I spent the first 2 nights in a bus station, watching the world move on without me. My phone was dead, my pride was crushed, and the gnawing hunger in my stomach was becoming a constant dull ache. I was invisible. That's the thing about homelessness. You stop being a person to the people rushing past you. You become scenery, an obstacle to be stepped around. On the 3rd morning, desperate and shivering, I saw a flyer stapled to a telephone pole near a park bench. It was a simple, stark white piece of paper with bold black lettering. Deep cleaning services needed. Immediate hire. High discretion required. Must be comfortable with solitude. Below it was an address for a sprawling estate on the edge of the hills, a place so removed from the city that it felt like a different country. I had no other options. I didn't even have bus fare, so I walked. I walked for 6 hours until my feet were blistered and bloody, fueled only by the sheer, blinding rage of wanting to prove them wrong. The estate was a fortress. High stone walls, cameras at every angle, and a gate that looked like it belonged to a prison rather than a residence. I pressed the buzzer, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. A crisp, synthesized voice crackled through the speaker. "State your business." "I'm here for the cleaning position," I croaked, my voice rough from lack of use. The gate didn't open immediately. There was a long, heavy silence, the kind that makes you wonder if they're checking your background, your history, your very soul. Then, with a mechanical groan, the iron swung inward. A man in a tailored gray suit stood on the gravel path. He wasn't the owner. He was the gatekeeper. He looked me up and down, taking in my dirty shoes and the trash bag I'd slung over my shoulder. He didn't look disgusted. He looked analytical. "Mr. Sterling is a private man," the assistant said, his voice devoid of warmth. "You will sign a non-disclosure agreement that covers the next 10 years of your life. You will work from dusk until dawn. You will never, under any circumstances, enter the west wing of the house. If you break these rules, you won't just lose the pay. We have ways of ensuring you never find work again." I signed the papers without even reading them. I would have signed my name in blood if he'd asked. He led me through a foyer that looked like a museum, full of cold marble and shadows that seemed to stretch longer than they should have. My job was straightforward. Keep the place pristine. Don't speak, don't look, just scrub. For 3 days, it was easy. I was left alone in a house so quiet I could hear my own pulse. But on the 4th night, while I was buffing the floors in the grand library, I heard something. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. It was a rhythmic tapping coming from behind the heavy mahogany bookshelf on the far wall. I knew the rules. I knew the consequences. But the sound changed. It became a desperate, frantic scratching. And then I heard a voice, muffled and panicked, whispering a name I hadn't heard in years. It was the name of my own father, who'd been declared missing a decade ago, whispered by someone trapped behind the wall, followed by the distinct, unmistakable sound of a heavy bolt being slid back from the other side. I froze, my rag dropping from my hand and landing with a soft thud on the polished floor. My blood felt like ice water pumping through my veins. The name, it was my father's name, Arthur Vance. A name that had been etched onto a tombstone in a cemetery I visited every year, a ghost I had finally learned to stop chasing. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural breathing that seemed to emanate from the very marrow of the house. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to run, to sprint out of the front doors and never look back at the iron gates. But the curiosity, that dangerous, fatal flaw that had already cost me my marriage and my dignity, held me rooted to the spot. I crept closer to the bookshelf. It wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was a concealed entrance. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I traced the edges of the wood. There was no seam, no handle, just cold, unyielding oak. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible above the hum of the climate control system. The response was immediate and terrifying. A hand, pale and skeletal, thrust itself through a hairline gap in the paneling. The fingers were thin, the nails broken and jagged, and they clawed frantically at the air until they hooked into the fabric of my shirt. I gasped, stumbling backward, dragging the shelf with me. With a groan of tortured wood, the bookshelf swung inward just an inch, revealing a sliver of darkness behind it. "Help me," a voice rasped. It sounded like grinding stones, ancient and dry. "They aren't who they say they are. None of them are." I should have pulled away. I should have bolted. Instead, I yanked the shelf open fully. The room beyond wasn't a secret library or a panic room. It was a cage. The walls were lined with monitors, screens flickering with live feeds of the entire estate, and not just the grounds. I saw my own apartment from 2 years ago. I saw the courthouse where I got married, and there, in a corner screen, I saw my wife's father sitting at a table with the man in the gray suit, passing a folder back and forth. The folder had my name on it in bold red ink. My head spun. The man in the cage was huddled in the corner, his face obscured by matted hair. He wasn't my father. He was much older, his skin mapped with deep surgical scars that looked like barcodes. He looked up and I recoiled. He didn't have eyes. Where they should have been, there were smooth patches of grafted skin. He was a blind prisoner, a human archive of secrets that the millionaire, Mr. Sterling, had clearly gone to great lengths to hide. "You're the new one," the prisoner wheezed, tilting his head as if listening to the sound of my panicked heartbeat. "You're the one they chose for the final phase. They don't want your labor, boy. They want your identity. They need a clean slate to pin the incoming charges on. By the time they're finished with you, you won't just be homeless, you'll be the face of a national investigation." "What are you talking about?" I hissed, crouching down to his level. "I'm just a cleaner. I'm no one." "That's exactly why you're perfect," he laughed, a wet, rattling sound. "Look at the desk, under the pile of ledgers." I turned to the metal desk in the center of the dark room. There, lying innocently atop a stack of blank identity documents, was a heavy, cold object, wrapped in a silk cloth. I unwrapped it, and my stomach dropped to the floor. It was illegal equipment, the kind that carried a minimum sentence of 20 years. Beside it sat a thumb drive and a stack of photos showing me, taken in secret, entering this house. The photos were dated starting yesterday, but they were photoshopped to make it look like I had been here for weeks, committing high-level corporate espionage. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The in-laws, the eviction, the hiring through the flyer. It was all a setup. They weren't just ruining my life, they were framing me for a massive systemic crime that was about to be laid at the feet of a convenient patsy. I was the patsy. Suddenly, the floor beneath us vibrated. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway, followed by the metallic click of a deadbolt being engaged from the outside. The assistant's voice, now devoid of all pretense of politeness, echoed through the intercom. "Mr. Vance, thank you for your curiosity. We were worried you'd take too long to find the evidence, but you've saved us a great deal of trouble. We've already contacted the authorities. The Service of the Interior is 5 minutes away. You have a choice. You can sit there and wait for the arrest, or you can pick up the bag behind the door and run into the woods. We have men waiting in the trees with cameras to record your flight. Either way, the life you knew is over." I looked at the prisoner, who was shivering uncontrollably. Behind him, the back wall of the cage began to glow with a strange violet light, and I heard the faint rhythmic beeping of a bomb timer. 3 minutes, the prisoner whispered, his voice trembling. "They're blowing the place to erase the witnesses. Run, boy, or stay and become a martyr for a crime you never committed." I grabbed the handle of the back door, but as I pulled, I saw a shadow move behind the glass. Someone was already standing on the other side, waiting for me to step out into their trap. The air in the room grew heavy, saturated with the metallic scent of ozone and the impending finality of the timer. My lungs burned as I gasped for oxygen, my brain racing through the impossible geometry of my situation. Behind the glass door, the shadow shifted. Not the silhouette of a guard, but something else. A flicker of movement. I realized then that the trap was layered. If I ran out, I'd be gunned down or captured on camera as a fleeing suspect. If I stayed, I'd be incinerated. "The ventilation duct," the blind man hissed, his hearing evidently sharper than any normal human's. "The grate behind the filing cabinet. It leads to the servant's crawlspace. It's the only way out that isn't rigged for visual confirmation." I didn't wait for him to explain further. I shoved the heavy filing cabinet aside, the metal screeching against the concrete floor like a dying animal. I tore the grate off, my fingernails bleeding as I clawed at the screws. I shoved myself into the dark, narrow tunnel, the stale air thick with dust and ancient cobwebs. I could hear the footsteps outside the room now, heavy boots, the rhythmic thud of professionals. They weren't coming to arrest me, they were coming to finalize the narrative. I crawled, skinning my elbows and knees on the rough interior until the floor beneath me ended abruptly. I plummeted, landing hard on a pile of discarded industrial linens in a basement sublevel. I wasn't out, but I was beneath the house. I scrambled to my feet, my adrenaline masking the pain in my ribs. I turned a corner, expecting a dead end, but found myself in a massive subterranean archive. This wasn't just a house. It was a nerve center for a vast, organized scheme. Walls were covered in maps, contact lists of high-ranking officials, and bank routing numbers that spanned continents. My father-in-law wasn't just a wealthy man. He was the treasurer for a network that specialized in laundering massive amounts of illicit capital, and I had just been handed the keys to their entire operation. But the silence was shattered by a low, mechanical hum. A red laser grid swept across the floor, and a voice, not the assistant's, but a new, deeper, more dangerous tone, filled the chamber. "Mr. Vance," the voice boomed from hidden speakers, "we admire your resourcefulness. Most men would have surrendered by now, but you've seen things that have caused the downfall of stronger men than you. You have a choice. Destroy the hard drives you've stumbled upon, and we will grant you a clean escape, an untraceable identity, and a life in a country where we have no reach. Or try to take this evidence to the authorities and know that you will be labeled as the orchestrator of this entire organized scheme. We have the digital breadcrumbs, the forged emails, and the financial records all pointing directly to you." I looked at the server bank in front of me. I had a heavy metal wrench I'd grabbed from the cleaning cart earlier. One swing would destroy the evidence that could prove my innocence, but it would also destroy the evidence that could put these people away for decades. I looked at the cameras tracking my every move. I knew what they wanted. They wanted me to be their scapegoat, their clean slate. If I walked away now, I'd be safe. I'd be a rich, anonymous man living on their dime, but I would be forever under their thumb, a puppet dancing on a string. I gripped the wrench, my knuckles white. "I'm not your puppet," I whispered to the camera. I swung the wrench, not at the hard drives, but at the main power conduit. The explosion of sparks was blinding, throwing the room into a chaotic strobe of electrical failure. The fire suppression system triggered instantly, filling the room with thick, white foam. In the confusion, I dove behind a stack of shipping crates. Suddenly, a door on the far side of the archive hissed open. A woman stepped out, silhouetted against the dim emergency lighting of the hallway. She wasn't holding a weapon. She was holding a tablet, her face calm, almost disappointed. She wasn't an assassin. She was the woman I had seen in the photos, the one my father-in-law had been meeting with. "You think this is about framing you for a robbery, Arthur?" she said, her voice dripping with pity. "You're the legacy, not the victim. Did you really think they kicked you out of the house because you were a drain? They needed to isolate you, to break you so that you would eventually find this room. This wasn't a setup for a criminal case. It was a recruitment process, and you just failed the final test." She pressed a button on her tablet, and the sound of a heavy, vault-like door locking behind me echoed through the basement. I lunged for her, but my legs suddenly buckled. A sharp, stinging sensation bloomed in my neck. I reached up, pulling a tiny, pressurized dart from my skin. As the world began to tilt and my vision blurred, she leaned over me, her face inches from mine. "We don't need a scapegoat, Arthur. We need a replacement for the man currently in that cage, and you're the perfect fit." I tried to crawl, but my limbs felt like lead. The last thing I saw before the darkness pulled me under was the blind man from the cage being wheeled into the room on a gurney, his face replaced by a complex, high-tech interface, and my own reflection staring back at me from a mirror on the wall. But the reflection wasn't mine anymore. It was a digital composite, perfectly mimicking my face, but with eyes that were cold, mechanical, and entirely void of humanity. The fog in my brain felt like thick, oily sludge, but the burning rage in my chest acted as a cauterizing agent, forcing me to remain conscious. I could feel the cold, sterile surface of a table beneath me and the sharp, rhythmic hum of machinery surrounding my head. They were trying to map my neural pathways, to overwrite my memories with their own encrypted protocols. I lay perfectly still, feigning the deep, drug-induced coma they expected, while my mind obsessively cataloged every twitch of the sensors attached to my temples. The woman, whose name I had overheard the technicians call Director, was pacing the room, her voice a calm, detached stream of instructions. "The biometric transfer is at 80%. Once we finalize the integration, he will believe he is the one who founded this network. He will be the perfect vessel for our operations, untraceable, motivated by a manufactured sense of justice, and completely under our cognitive control." I knew that at 90% the neural lock would become permanent. I had seconds. I focused on the tiny hidden transmitter I'd managed to palm from the cleaning cart back in the library. A simple high-frequency signal jammer I had swiped from the assistant's jacket while he was distracted by the security console. It was meant to be a backup, a way to cut communication for a few minutes. I reached into the pocket of my discarded pants, which had been tossed on a nearby chair, and jammed the device against the server rack. A high-pitched whine erupted, followed by a series of explosive pops as the server bank short-circuited. The room plunged into darkness, save for the strobing blue of the emergency lighting. The magnetic restraints holding my wrists loosened as the power surge fried the local circuits. I didn't hesitate. I ripped the sensors from my skin, feeling the sting of tearing flesh, and launched myself off the table. I didn't head for the door. I headed for the console they were using to run the simulation. I slammed my fist into the terminal, effectively uploading the encrypted file of my own consciousness, the real me, into the building's primary broadcast feed. Simultaneously, I bypassed the internal security and triggered the building's fire suppression and siren system. It wasn't just a fire alarm, it was a broadcast signal meant for the internal security force, now redirected to the servers of the Service of the Interior. I had linked their terminal to the public cloud. Every ledger, every illicit record, and every recorded conversation proving the organized scheme was now streaming live to the police department's secure server. The door burst open and guards swarmed in, but they were too late. The sirens were blaring and the exterior gates had locked down, trapping the leadership inside the very fortress they had built to protect their secrets. The woman looked at her tablet, her face pale for the first time as the screen filled with the red text notifications of a total system compromise. "You idiot!" she shrieked, lunging for the console. "You've just signed your own death warrant. If this goes public, you're the one holding the smoking gun." "Let them come," I shouted, my voice raw but steady as I backed toward the ventilation hatch I had used before. "I've already sent the decryption keys to the press. Everyone is watching now." I didn't wait to see her reaction. I dove into the vent, sliding down the chute as the sound of sirens, the real ones, began to wail in the distance, growing louder by the second. I burst out into the cool night air of the forest, the rain still falling, but for the first time in weeks, I could breathe. I didn't stop running until I hit the main road, where the flashing lights of a dozen cruisers were converging on the estate. I stood there, soaked, exhausted and penniless, as they dragged my father-in-law and his associates out of the iron gates in handcuffs. He looked at me as they shoved him into the back of a squad car. The look of pure, unadulterated fear on his face was the most satisfying thing I had ever seen. The cleaner had cleaned house, but not in the way they intended. It took months for the legal process to clear my name. The records I leaked were ironclad, proving that I was a victim of a forced, coerced setup. I had to testify, I had to hide in protective custody, and I had to walk away from everything I once thought I needed. But as I stood in front of my own small rented apartment a year later, watching the sun rise over a city that no longer felt like a prison, I realized I had won. I wasn't the man who was homeless and desperate anymore. I was the man who had torn down an empire with nothing but a rag, a wrench, and a burning desire for the truth. The past was buried, the villains were behind bars, and for the first time in my life, my future was finally, truly, my own.